are going to talk about the Comair Flight 5191 today. Next slide. All right, so on August 27th, 2006, Comair Flight 5191 crashed during takeoff from Bluegrass Airport, Lexington, Kentucky. The flight crew was instructed to take off from runway 22, but instead lined up on the airplane on runway 26 and began the takeoff roll. The airplane ran off the end of the runway and impacted the airport perimeter fence, trees, and terrain. The flight was operating under the provisions of 14 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 121, and was en route for Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, Atlanta, Georgia. During this time, it was night visual meteorological conditions. Next slide. So what went wrong? The flight crew collected the flight release paperwork, which included weather information, safety of flight notices to airmen, which otherwise known as NOTAMs, the tail number of the airplane to be used for the flight, and the flight plan. The flight crew then proceeded to an area on the air carrier ramp where 2 other CRJs were parked. And originally, the crew actually went to the wrong airplane, but an agent that was performing security check saw them and notified them that they were on the wrong plane, so they had to shut that plane down and then board onto the correct plane. So it's kind of a debate whether there's a huge part of relevance of this to the actual case itself, but that's just some more information about that. The FDR, otherwise known as flight data recording, showed that the captain stopped the airplane at the holding short position for runway 26, while the airplane was still at the hold short line for runway 26. The first officer told the controller that Comair 121 was ready to depart at his leisure. About 3 seconds later, the controller responded, Comair 191, fly runway heading, cleared for takeoff. Neither the first officer or ATC controller stated the runway number during the request and clearance for takeoff. FDR data showed that the magnetic heading of the airplane at that time was about 266 degrees, which corresponded with the magnetic heading runway for 26. FDR data showed that the airplane reached its maximum airspeed of 137 knots. The aircraft performance study for this accident showed that at that time the airplane impacted a tree about 900 feet from the end of runway 26. So the significance, as you can see on the picture provided, of the difference between the runways for runway 4 and 22, it's an air carrier runway, 7,003 feet long and 150 feet in width. It had high intensity runway lights and center line lights and runway and identifier lights. But at this time, those lights were out of service because of construction on the runway. Whereas runway 26, where that is a general aviation runway, the one that they took off of, was used for about 2% of the airport's total operations. So it was not subject to the requirements of 14 CFR 139, and the runway was 3,501 foot long and 150 feet wide. So that's just some significance of the 2 runways and how the one that they were on, 26, was not the correct, and it was not long enough or wide enough for them to take off of. Next slide. As for the outcome, unfortunately, the captain, flight attendant, and 47 passengers were killed. The one survivor, which was the first officer, received serious injuries, which prohibits him from flying today. And the airplane, of course, was destroyed by impact forces and post-crash fire. Next slide. So who's to blame? The National Transportation Safety Board determined that the probable cause of this accident was the flight crew members' failure to use available cues and aids to identify the airplane's location on the airport surface during taxi, and their failure to cross-check and verify that the airplane was on the correct runway before takeoff. And then also contributing to this could be during taxi, they had the first officer and the captain had a conversation that was not relevant to the flight or safety of flight, and that could have potentially resulted in loss of positional awareness. And then because both pilots were experienced, they should have been knowledgeable about the basic airport geographic features and signage and surface markings standards, and they should have been skilled at interpreting the airport charts. In addition to their knowledge about the specific route, multiple external cues and features were available to support or for the pilots to support their navigation to runway 22, and no evidence indicated that their view from the windscreen was obstructed. Observations from a CRJ 100 airplane after the accident told investigators that they took off prior to before the crash, and said that the lights taxiway location signs were visible along the full length of the taxi route. A runway 26 holding position sign adjacent to the runway 26 hold short line was visible, and the runway 26 numbers were visible. Also, evidence indicated that at the time of the accident, the signs identifying the critical features along the taxi route were illuminated and would have been visible to both pilots. So there was evidence from another plane that all the lighting there and markings were there. And so in our case, for our plane, they just didn't notice that before, which they would be to blame for that. The flight crew members had resources available to them within the cockpit to support their navigation to runway 22, including airport charts. Even though discrepancies existed between the airport chart and the external cues available to the pilots, because of an ongoing construction project at the airport, the chart depicted the paved taxiway and runway surfaces at the time of the accident. And then, of course, another available resource was within the cockpit was instrumentation, including the heading bug, which had been set to 227 to correspond to the magnetic heading for runway 22. This heading information, which is clearly presented on both flight crew members' MFDs and PFDs, would have provided the pilots with a real-time cue of their orientation relative to runway 22. And so one of the component of SMS that was neglected that contributed to this accident would be the lack of risk management, which includes hazard identification and risk assessment. The pilots were having a conversation during flight that was off topic to pre-flight or relevant to the safety of their flight. Along with that, the pilots were both highly respected and skilled in the aviation world and should have been well knowledgeable enough to read the charts or check the magnetic compass as a safety assurance. This to me demonstrates a primary trap of self-enhancement. Because of the superiority bias, the pilots were both very comfortable and confident to the point where they looked over some of the responsibilities they have to confirm their location, and therefore resulting in them being on the runway. Next slide.
So the after effects of the crash of Comair Flight 51901, the FAA now requires markers painted on the taxiway before entering the runway. Before there would just be signs, and although the FAA and the NTSB has stated that the signs were visible at that time, they just wanted another thing for pilots to be able to see, so the confusion would be less and pilots would be able to double check once more before entering the runway. LEX, which is Lexington, changed their runway configuration. As we can see, their GA airport is now completely separate from their main runway. They actually wanted to change the configuration for a long time because the old configuration was built during World War II, so it was a pretty old design. The military liked to have a triangular pattern. That was very confusing as the time went on. Different planes, much bigger, much more powerful. It needed to be changed. A new taxiway to the main runway, and then a new taxiway to the GA runway. Once again, just for the confusion to be less for the pilots, and also change to ATC. By that, I mean that tower now requires 2 controllers to be in there at all times. During the crash, there was actually supposed to be 2 controllers in there, but the regulations at the time were pretty confusing. So the airport only thought they needed 1 controller in, and that was not the case. Along with that, Comair airline has ceased to exist since 2012. They were part of Delta, but now no longer exist. And then next slide. In summary, it was an accident, like we have said, simple mistake of just thinking that everything is okay and thinking that you know everything when in reality that you should double check. The pilots were very well respected, as we've stated. Um, the captain was a 35-year-old family man. He was a great pilot according to everyone that you talked to, whether it's first officers, captains, family, it didn't really matter. Along with the first officer, same thing can be said about him. He's about 42, respected man. Everyone knew he was a great pilot, and um, it he was the one that did survive. But you can always double check with ATC if unclear, and you should double check if it is needed. Keep the conversations to a minimum, especially when they're not aviation related, and it's okay to ask for help when needed. And then sources, and that is